Okay, we are now recording. So hello everybody, my name is Caleb Hutchins. I'm an instructional designer in the e-learning department. And for this session, we are going to be talking about creating effective grading rubrics. Because in my opinion, rubrics are an extremely useful tool for assessing students and for providing feedback, but it can be really challenging to make a good rubric, a rubric that is effective, that gives you the grading options that you're looking for, gives your students feedback that is helpful, and it can be intimidating to build a rubric from scratch. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So for today's topic, first of all, why should you consider using rubrics? We'll briefly talk about that. Although you probably already have some idea of that, otherwise you wouldn't be in this session. How can I design an effective grading rubric? That'll be the bulk of this presentation. And then lastly, how do rubrics work with Canvas? Because Canvas does have a pretty good integration with grading rubrics. There's some little quirks and tricks to using it effectively, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about that. So first of all, why should I consider using rubrics? Well, I think that rubrics are helpful to articulate clear, transparent grading criteria to students. It gives them a very clear idea ahead of time of what you are looking for in a finished product or finished student process. It gives them very transparent criteria so that they know what's expected of them. A good rubric can help you maintain objectivity when grading and avoid grading bias. That's a big part of what we talk about in our office is how do we promote student equity and anti-bias in our classrooms and in our class designs, and quality objective rubrics can be a big help with that. They are a way of providing more detailed student feedback.
Yep, you too. Bye.
Hey, Jerry. Jerry, your audio's on. That's all right. A good rubric, a well-designed rubric, can provide a lot of detailed student feedback without requiring you to write a lot of detailed feedback for each student. So potentially that is a big time saver on your part while still providing useful feedback. And then it can also be used as a tool for student self-assessment and peer feedback. And then again, I think one of the biggest draws of rubrics is it potentially, yeah, at least Jerry wasn't complaining about us. Potentially rubrics are a huge time saver for you. Once you have a well-designed rubric attached to an assignment, it saves you a lot of time when it comes to grading a paper or a discussion post or any other kind of student product or student process or demonstration. And is potentially a huge time saver. So then the question is, how can I design an effective grading rubric? Now, a lot of what we're going to be talking about here comes from a really excellent journal article from Wolf and Stevens, The Role of Rubrics in Advancing and Assessing Student Learning. So if you want to really get into the weeds on this, that's a great place to start. And again, I'll share this PowerPoint with everybody later so you can get that link if you want. But in their article, they kind of break down rubric design into 4 steps. First, identifying performance criteria, then setting performance levels, then creating performance descriptions, and then assigning point values. So those are the steps that we're going to go through together here. And as we're going along, feel free to ask questions or leave comments in the chat, or even just interrupt me, unmute yourself if you have a question you want to call out. So the first step is identifying your performance criteria. What are the key features that define the student's product or performance? What are you looking for in that assignment? So this is going to be different for every assignment that you design, and it's going to be different in different fields and different departments and different courses. If you teach a writing class, then obviously the mechanics of a written paper are going to be a huge part of what you are grading. The basic grammar and punctuation, whether they follow the style guide that you've given them, whether their citations are good or not. But if you're teaching a different topic and you're just assigning writing as a way of assessing student understanding or student reflection, then maybe you don't care as much about the mechanics. So that's not necessarily one of the key features that define the student product for you. But that's something that you have to determine for every assignment that you're giving your students, is what are the key features that you are looking for and that you are looking at when you are assessing the student work. Those criteria need to be observable and measurable. So an example of an unobservable criteria would be student understands the importance of the Civil War in US history. Well, you can't observe a student's understanding because that's in their head, right? You can't get into their brain and know if they understood it or not. So what you really need to be asking yourself is, how can a student demonstrate that understanding? Does that mean being able to recall dates and names of important figures, important battles? Does it mean being able to describe the narrative of the history of the Civil War? Does it mean understanding the context that it happened, the history leading up to it, the opposing viewpoints, and how different people's perspectives played into the Civil War? Those are things that students can tell you or show you, and that you can observe or measure. So when you are coming up with your performance criteria, you always have to be very cognizant of how you're going to measure that criteria. In most rubrics, between 3 and 6 criteria are usually best. Just because if you have a rubric that has 10 or 15 criteria in a row, that can be overwhelming to the students. So they're less likely to even understand all of them at once, let alone meet them all. And it is also going to be a lot of work for you to have to assess that many criteria for each student's work. So usually between 3 and 6 are a good number to start with. And depending on the assignment, you might need more than that. If it's a big, complicated project, then you might need 7 or 8 criteria so that you meet all of the components of the project. Or if it's a very simple project, you might only need 1 criteria. But in general, 3 to 6 is a good starting point. And criteria in a rubric can be weighted by importance. So, again, if it's an English class or a writing class, then the writing mechanics are going to be pretty heavily weighted in your assignments. If it's an engineering class where you don't care as much about the mechanics, but you still want it to be readable, you still need to be able to understand what the student is trying to say, then you might still have a criteria for the mechanics of the writing quality, but it may not be as highly weighted as a different instructor would weight it. Something that I think is kind of an interesting idea is potentially criteria can be co-created with your students. So if you are introducing a big project to your class, you might want to take the time to have them talk about what criteria are important for this particular assignment. If you are having them give an oral presentation in class, you can, as a class, determine, well, what's important about that? Is it speaking volume? Is it the quality of your argument? Is it the structure of your presentation? Is it eye contact? What matters in this assignment? And let the students help you come up with that. I'm not saying that's appropriate for every activity or every class, but it's one way of really getting buy-in from your students about what matters in an assignment. And sometimes they might surprise you by coming up with a criteria that you hadn't thought of. Either a criteria that's a great idea to include, and you're like, why didn't I think of that? Or potentially it's a criteria that really doesn't matter. And then maybe it's worth talking about that with your students. Well, why do you think this is important? Let's take a minute and explore that. And maybe we can come around to getting on the same page with that. So here's a very basic rubric that we're going to be building following these steps. So performance criteria, that's the column over on the left-hand side of your rubric. And in this case, the criteria is writing quality. Pretty simple, right? Okay, so we have a criteria. Next step is setting your performance levels. That's the rows that go across in your rubric. And again, 3 to 6 levels are most common. A good rule of thumb that I was taught when I was first learning to teach is that for early and formative assessments in a class, more levels are more helpful because that gives you more granularity in your assessment and in your feedback as students are still developing their skills, still trying to understand what is important in an assignment and still learning the content. Giving them more performance levels provides more feedback to them and more granularity to you. Whereas if it's a big summative assessment towards the end of a quarter or towards the, for midterm or something, where, okay, this is it. This is where you demonstrate your knowledge, demonstrate your understanding, demonstrate your skill set. And either you're going to get it right or you're not, then fewer levels may be needed because that's going to make it easier for you to get through all the grading. It's going to save you time if there are fewer levels. So that was just kind of a rule of thumb that I was taught. Big summative assessments need fewer performance levels. Smaller or earlier formative assessments, more levels are helpful. And that's what I just said. I forgot that I have that on my PowerPoint. Consider the purpose and context for your performance language. So this is how you're labeling those performance levels, thinking about the language that you're using for that. Is this kind of a developmental class where you are teaching some very foundational skills in a subject area? Then you might want to use developmental language for your performance levels, like beginner, developing, arrived. If it's a kind of mastery based where they're working at their own pace and they're going to keep working on this until they figure it out, then you might use proficiency, below proficient, proficient, above proficient. Is it an observational rubric? Maybe it's a rubric that you're using when a student is giving an oral presentation and you're observing specific things that they do or say or include in their product or performance. Then you might use observational language like always, usually, sometimes, rarely, never. So the language that you use for these performance levels, again, it depends on the purpose and the context of the assignment. So that's something that you need to think about for your class and for your assignment. Figure out the context of where that is occurring and what you're hoping your students are going to get out of it. And that's going to help you design those performance level labels. So again, back to our rubric, here's a very simple 3 performance levels: above proficient, proficient, below proficient. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Once you've got your rows or your rows and your columns, then we need to start filling in those cells with performance descriptions. So usually it's best to keep those descriptions as brief as you can make them, because if every cell is a great big long paragraph, then again, that's harder for students to keep track of. It can be overwhelming, especially for beginning students. And it will make your job harder later when you are referencing your rubric as you're grading and giving feedback. If every cell has 10 things in that cell, then you're going to have to spend a lot of time drilling through that and making sure you're catching everything. So if you can keep them brief, that's going to be better for you and for your students. You should accurately explain each specific attribute of the student's product or performance that you'll be examining. So again, when we are identifying the key features that we're looking for in a student assignment, we need to be specific on every single one of those features that has to be included in your rubric, because that's what you're grading based on. And then descriptions should be parallel for each level and criteria, meaning if you mention a feature in this description, you should continue to mention it throughout the other descriptions. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. So here's some basic description cells for our writing quality rubric here. Paper is clear, well organized, easy to read. That's kind of one feature. Follows APA style guidelines, that's 2. Contains no significant mechanical errors, that's 3. So then in the proficient row, we have to hit all 3 points again. It's generally clear and concise. Follows APA style guidelines with a few errors and is mostly free of mechanical errors. Or below proficient, paper is poorly organized, doesn't follow the style, contains multiple errors. So again, you're covering each one of those at each level. This is a very, very simple example rubric. In your situation, you may find that you need more granularity than that. You might want to, again, if you're really focusing on those mechanical issues, you might need to have more levels where you say, paper has 2 or fewer mechanical mistakes, 3 or more mechanical mistakes, 10 or more mechanical mistakes. You might need that granularity, or you might be able to keep it as simple as this. And then once you've done that, then you assign point values to each of those performance levels. Point values between levels should be consistent. And you need to be aware of how your rubric values translate to a letter grade. So what that means is it's easy to inadvertently make a rubric too strict, where let's say you have a grade worth 10 points, and each level on that rubric is 1 point. Well, if a student got proficient instead of above proficient on 2 of your criteria, now they're sitting at an 80%. And you have to think about, is that accurate? If they got proficient on these and above proficient on everything else, is that B level work, or is that higher, or is that lower? So you need to be careful when you are assigning those point values to make sure that the cells in your rubric are lining up with the letter grade or the percentage grade that you intend to give your students. Something else to consider, do you want to put different weights on different criteria? Because again, in Canvas rubric design, you can put different weights on things. So I could have one criteria where it's worth between 6 points and 0 points, another one that's worth between 3 points and 0 points. And you can put different weights on things like that to emphasize the importance of each criteria. Another thing to consider, do you want a 0 point performance level? You might, or you might not. So obviously, if a student doesn't turn in any work, they're going to get a 0, right? Regardless of what the rubric says. If there's no work, there's nothing to grade. But you might want to give at least 1 point if they've turned something in, even if it's very poor and it's missing a bunch of the features that you're looking for. You still want to give them something for the effort. But you might also have criteria where you do want to give them 0 points. If it's a research paper and you are expecting a citations page or a reference page, and they don't give you one, do you give them a 0 for that? So that's the kind of thing that you need to decide as you are designing your rubric, And if you want a 0-point performance level, then include that. I had this on here, but I think that might actually be incorrect when it comes to Canvas. Ben or Jerry, can you chime in on this one? Do the rubric point values have to equal the assignment point value in Canvas? They do not, no. Okay, good, so I did get that right. So if your grade item is worth 10 points and you have, say, a 9-point rubric, 3-2-1, 3-2-1, 3-2-1, that's okay, because Canvas will automatically calculate that into the total score for them. So if I give them a 3, a 3, and a 3, they're going to get 100%, so they're going to get 10 points. If I give them a 3, a 2, and a 3, then they're going to get, I can't do the math, like 85%, 90. So it does not have to equal the assignment point value in Canvas. Yeah, correct. That freaks Ben's brain out, so I try to align them. I agree. It's just easier for your own brain to know that the point value in the rubric is going to be the point value that the student gets, but it doesn't have to be that way. So here we have the scores, or the point values for the performance level, 3, a 2, and a 1. And again, you might want to have a 0 level, or if they just don't turn anything in, they're going to get a 0. But if they turn something in, even if it's, in this case, poorly organized, doesn't follow the style, and has a bunch of errors that confuse you, well, they still turn in something, and you're still giving them feedback, so you're going to get them a 1. So any questions so far on designing a rubric? Has anybody tried building a rubric and wasn't happy with what they came up with? Anybody want to speak to that? And if nobody does, that's okay. But we'll give a moment in case anybody has any comments.
Caleb, this is Kathy. I have a question for Jennifer from the chat. How do you set up a rubric to give extra credit points above the assessment total?
Ooh, that's a good question. Jennifer, how do you do that?
So it's listed as a criteria. And so say, for example, I have an assessment where it's worth 35 points. And if I build in extra credit into that rubric criteria, then I'll get this question at the end that says, the numbers don't line up. Are you okay with this? And I say yes. And so then as I'm clicking through, like for a discussion board, I will give a student an extra credit point if they post their original response 24 to 48 hours prior to everybody else. And so they'll get an extra credit point for that. Or like if it's a super demanding concept where I think it would be good if students shared something like a picture, I'll say, if you have expanded what we're talking about and you want to include a video with your post, you might get an extra credit point for that. So it just becomes a criteria, and it's either a 1 or a 0.
But that's just an extra point on top of the 35 that the grade value is worth, is that?
Yes.
Okay, very cool. That's a great idea. Okay, so when is it not a great idea to use rubrics? Because personally, I'm a fan of rubrics, but they're not always the right answer to every situation. Might not be appropriate for small or spontaneous assignments because it's going to take you time to build a rubric. If it's a quick little one-off thing that you're in class and hey, you know what, we're gonna do a quick little mini quiz or a roundtable discussion, and I want to give you the grade for it. It might not be worth your time to sit down and try to design a whole rubric for that. So be aware of your own time constraints here. Don't force yourself to make a rubric when it's not necessarily worth it. That being said, it's easy to reuse a rubric more than once. If you have graded discussions in Canvas in your class, you only need one discussion rubric, and you can use it over and over again for each discussion topic. So you can reuse rubrics in more than one assignment. But it may not be appropriate if it's something small or spontaneous. Rubrics are not particularly useful when there's only one correct answer. Canvas, I don't believe, does not let you put a rubric on a quiz, because for a multiple choice quiz or a true false quiz, there's really only one right answer. There's no need to have the granularity of a rubric if there's either it's right or it's wrong. And then another thing to be aware of, a poorly designed rubric might constrain student creativity or willingness to take risk. So if you have a rubric where you're putting, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Let's say you want students to give a presentation in class, and you have a criteria that says must have at least 5 slides in a PowerPoint presentation. Well, by doing that, by saying that in your rubric, you're telling your students you must do a PowerPoint presentation. And that may not have been your intention. You might have a student that wants to do a different kind of presentation. They might want to use a Prezi presentation which doesn't have slides. It's more of a spatial thing where their presentation moves around a space to give you different things. They might want to, I've seen students that wanted to give a presentation in the form of a song. So they brought their guitar to class and they did a song. And the content of the song was great. It was what the instructor was hoping to see. So clearly they were demonstrating their understanding, but they didn't use a PowerPoint. So when you are designing rubrics, you need to be careful that you're not unintentionally constraining your students' creativity on that assignment. Any other questions so far? Otherwise, we're going to jump into Canvas and kind of show a few things here. Okay, so I need to stop.
I do have a question.
Oh yeah, please.
Sorry, a little slow in the unmute.
Go for it.
I have a lot of exams in my type of course. It's not like a lot of writing and things like that, but I do have essay questions. Is it something that you would be providing the rubric on the exam for those essay questions? I give a document on how I score it all, but is that something you would do?
Yeah, I think if you have a significant number of essay questions where a rubric would make sense, then yeah, by all means, provide that to the students just so that they know what you're expecting. Unfortunately, you can't build that rubric into the quiz tool in Canvas. So if you wanted to have that integration, then you would probably have to do those in the form of a written submission assignment instead of a quiz where they're giving you a paper. I don't think you can do that with the essay questions in the quiz tool. But if you have that rubric that you're using as you're grading the essays, then yeah, by all means, maybe put it into a Word document or a PDF and upload it alongside the quiz. Or, I mean, you could even put it into the quiz description. You could paste your table right in there and they could see it before the quiz starts. So that would also be an option. All right, any other comments or questions before we move forward here? Okay, let me stop sharing my screen for a second and get into a Canvas course.
I found they really helped me identify what I wanted.
Yeah.
To see from students, where I thought by building a rubric that this is what I wanted, but then I realized certain attributes of the scores didn't reflect what I really wanted. So, I mean, I like Jennifer's comment. Feel free to critique. It's always a work in progress. I always felt my second rubric on an assignment was much better than the first one. The first one was kind of a stab in the dark, but the second kind of passed through, really helped refine what I wanted in my head.
Totally agree. I've had the same experience where sometimes it takes a couple iterations to hone in on what you are trying to actually assess, what you're actually looking for. And also I found that I unintentionally had the scoring on my rubric set up so that I was penalizing students way more than I intended to. So if they got less than perfect on just one criteria, they ended up with a 90, a low A, which was probably not appropriate in my situation. yeah, they should have maybe gotten a 95%, but the way I had the scoring set up, it automatically dropped them a full letter. So I had to adjust those scoring criteria in my rubric to get what I wanted. Okay, let me share my screen again. All right, so this is maybe a little bit more some remedial Canvas rubric information. If you've already built rubrics, this may not all be news to you, but if you haven't yet and you're thinking about it, then hopefully this will be helpful. So we're just in a Canvas course. And if we go to rubrics and add
falling down that stairs, Karen?
and add a rubric. So it's fairly straightforward here. We give it a title. So and then we have, it starts off with one criteria and you can add others. We click on the little pencil here to edit that criteria, and then we give it a name or a description. Some people like to put longer descriptions in their criteria description, maybe even like a bullet point list of the 3 or 4 or 5 features that you're going to be looking for this criteria. That might be appropriate in some cases, it might not be necessary in others. We have that option here. And then for the ratings, what they call ratings, what I call performance levels. Let me go back a step. So it gives you a very basic one to start off with, either full marks or no marks, 5 points or 0 points. So if we click on the little pencil next to one of these ratings, we can edit the point value that it's worth and then also the title of it. So I might say excellent is full points. Unacceptable is 0 points. And then we can add as many other levels within that as we want. So acceptable would be a mid-range. So again, you could have as many or as few as you want. It could be as simple as a yes or a no. And in some cases, you might just need a yes or no for one criteria. If your rubric is for discussion boards and you have a criteria that's just, did you post by Friday or not, yes or no, then you only need 2 options for that. So you can keep adding as many ratings as you want. You can add another criteria. You can also duplicate an existing one if you have a bunch of information in there already. Doesn't matter. Oh, so the other thing that you actually need to do in Canvas, rather than having separate cells for each one of these, you actually need to put the description into each of these ratings. So for excellent, I need to put the description here. Or whatever you want to say for that. And then you'll do that with each one of these. You'll notice that since I just made a new criteria, it didn't copy over the ratings that I had here. It just gave me the 5 or the 0 again. If I want to keep using that same range for everything, then I can duplicate one of these. And it'll keep the range that I've already set up. And again, you can weight these differently. So paper length, maybe that's only worth 1 point because it's a yes or a no sort of answer. And it automatically changes those scores. And then you can see our total point value is 11 here. While we're here, since I didn't know that you could set one of these up to have extra credit, how would we do that? Ben or Jerry, help me out here.
I think if you set your criteria for 0 and then just add point, make it a, just say extra credit.
Oh, let's try that.
I think, I don't know. I've never.
Well, let's try it.
I've never, well, let me Google that real quick.
So if we set the point value for that criteria to 0, And then we give this extra credit, we give that a point. Update rating. So that changes that to be worth a point. Then it changes it back over here. So that doesn't let us do that. Interesting. I can hear Jerry typing away furiously trying to find the answer for us.
This is talking about. I'm gonna have to do some research on that.
Okay, we might have to come back to that one.
I don't know. I mean, I've never heard of anybody doing it in a rubric before, but I mean, I'm sure you could.
Yeah. Jennifer, are you still here or did she have to leave?
Yeah, no, I'm here. So
are.
I just set it up as a criteria, and like if you're going to do extra credit right there, leave it as 1 to 0. And so then the other trick is then when you create your assessment, okay, so this total is 12 points right now, right? And you want to be able to give 1 point of extra credit.
Yep.
So then that would mean that your assessment needs to be a total of 11 points.
Okay. All right. So then let's try that. So that means we don't actually have to do anything here to make this work a secret extra credit. We just treat it like a normal criteria worth either 1 point or 0 points. All right. So we're going to create that rubric and it's worth 12 points. So now if I go into my assignments, and I've already got an assignment here, so let's edit this and see if we can, we've already got a rubric attached to it, so we'll unattach that one. All right, so we have this assignment here, a learning technology paper. We click on add a rubric, and we can either build one from scratch here, or we can find a rubric, find an existing one, and it'll actually show us all the rubrics that we have access to, not just in this one class. They'll show me my other ones. So if I'm teaching 4 different classes and they all have discussion post assignments and I grade them all the same way, then I can just reuse the same discussion post rubric over and over again. In this case, I'm going to take that test rubric that we created here.
So Caleb, so that Hutchins, would that be, that's not going to be one of my course numbers?
No, so this is just the name of the course that I'm in. This is a test course, so it's called
test course, right?
Courses Hutchins, because it's just named after me. It'll be the name of your courses here, is what'll show up in this bar here.
If I had my sort of dummy course that I pull everything from to put into my each quarter, it could be listed there as well.
Yes, it'll show. Yeah, it doesn't just show live courses. If you have a master course or a test course that you build things in, it'll show up in this list, and you can pull a rubric right out of it.
Thank you.
So we're going to use that test rubric. Okay, so let's see here. The rubric is worth 12 points. The assignment is worth 9. Let's edit that to be worth 11. Let's see how that extra credit works for us. Okay, so we have an assignment worth 11 points, a rubric that goes up to 12 points. And I already have a student test assignment in here. So if I go into SpeedGrader, and it loads up this test student submission, if we look over here and we click on View Rubric, then it gives us the rubric that we've attached to this assignment. So we can read through the paper, we refer to our rubric as we go, and then we score them. We just click on this and it automatically gives us our point value here. But let's give full marks and extra credit, and I'm curious to see what that does with our grade. Because as soon as we do this and we hit save, it should, it did not transfer that into the grade field. Now, why didn't it do that?
You need to set it up in the rubric to say that you want it to use the scores that you, like it's at the bottom of the rubric.
I missed a setting.
So scroll down.
Yep, you're right. Yep. So after we have the rubric attached, thank you. I missed that step. We also have these extra.
This is where it's going to ask you that it's not the same point value.
Gotcha. So we're going to use this rubric for assignment grading. We're going to update the rubric.
There you go.
The assignment's total points at 11 and the rubric's total points at 12 will result in a maximum possible score of 109%. Perfect. So we can either change that if this was on accident and we don't want them to be different, we could go back and change those values. We're going to leave it as different. Great. So now let's try this again. So we're looking at the student submission. We give them their score on the rubric, and then we hit save. And now it gives them their score. In this case, 12 out of 11, so they're going to get extra credit. If I didn't have that extra credit field, then it'll translate that into their letter grade. And we'll hit submit. And I think we're good here. So once you start using rubrics like this, in this case, there's not a lot of information to go off of for students, but a good rubric is going to have descriptions in each one of these cells. And then this is what it looks like from the student's point of view. And I hope this works correctly with the test student, because sometimes it doesn't. But if we go into student view, and the student has a grade, so I'm going to check my grades. And I can see that I got my score here, but I also have this little icon here that'll show me how I scored on the rubric. So by looking at this as a student, I don't just see my score, I also see why I got that score. So if I got less than a perfect grade, I can see, well, my paper length wasn't long enough. I was only 1 page instead of 2 pages, so I didn't get the points there. I was missing something in my citation, so I didn't get a full grade there. So by having a well-written descriptive rubric here as an instructor, I'm providing a ton of written feedback to my students without having to write anything. Now, you still have the option of giving written feedback, and I would still encourage you to do that in most cases. You can even, let's get out of student view again. I believe you can even give more detailed feedback within the rubric. So if the student didn't get full marks on this, I could even leave a comment or something like that. Or even if it was a great score, but I still want to leave a comment, I can leave more detailed feedback within the rubric, and students can do that later. But even if I don't do any writing, if I just use my rubric, then I'm giving them a fair amount of feedback, formative assessment feedback with that rubric. By doing that, I'm saving myself a ton of time by not having to write the same thing over and over again. You know, if students are consistently missing the citation sheet, yes, on every student I can type out, you didn't have the citation, so I docked you 5 points, type that over and over and over again, or I can just click that button on the rubric and they will get that same feedback without me having to type it out every time. Does that all make sense? Any other questions about how the rubric tool works in Canvas? It's pretty straightforward from a technical perspective. The challenge, again, is creating a good rubric based on what you actually want to observe and assess in your students' work. But hopefully,
if we have some rubrics, it's pretty much just open up like the Word document, cut and paste into Canvas. We can't import that.
If you have rubrics written in like a table in Word, I don't think you can copy and paste the whole thing.
Just
unfortunately,
sections.
You'd have to do each cell one at a time, which it'll take a little bit of time, but not a ton of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions about either the technical side of this or the design side of this? I'm just reading through the chat real quick to see if I missed anything. Nothing that I see. That's pretty much what I have for this presentation. So I'm going to keep this open for a few more minutes if you have any other questions or discussions. I'm also going to pop up a quick little poll here for everybody. This is just sort of a self-assessment for myself to make sure that we're hitting on a topic that is actually useful to people.
And you're keeping us interested, just like Ben told us earlier with the Zoom sessions. That could work.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Karen. Thanks for attending. Hopefully that was helpful to you. And yeah, I'm going to keep this open a couple more minutes in case we have any other questions or comments. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and hopefully you got some useful information out of campus training day.
Yeah, thank you, Caleb.
Thank you, Kelly.
Hey, Ben, can I get into a different Zoom with you? That's
Yeah, let
easiest.
me send you a link.
All right, thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.